Hey everyone, I'm Peter Askim. I'm Artistic Director of the next Festival of Emerging Artists, and I'm really excited to welcome you here. This is our final Next Fest Connects workshop for the spring of 2021. And we are just putting the final touches on our next Festival of Emerging Artists, which will be running June 8th through July 1st. And this is going to be really exciting experiences for a select group of students and participants and fellows, but also, we are here to make as much available and helpful to you, our audience, as possible. So we will be doing lots of events, um, guest talks, master classes, workshops that are open to the public and free for you. And so I encourage you to look out for that announcement, which will be coming very soon. We'll be announcing that just around the corner. We were just tweaking the press release right before we came on. I'm putting in the chat right now a link to our website and also a link to our guest artist today, Elaine Grogan Luttrull. She founded Minerva Financial Arts, and she has been an amazing part of this series. So what we try and do is provide you with information and inspiration and connection and community about the things that are important to you right now. And Elaine has been a crucial part of that. She's done amazing talks that you can find on our YouTube page about being paid fairly, about different ways of budgeting, about thinking about portfolio careers. And so I just wanted to welcome her to today to talk about something that's on all of our minds, which is funding in the age of COVID for the arts. And just great to have you back, Elaine. How's it going?
It's great to be back. I am doing well. Thank you, Peter, and welcome to everyone. I love seeing a few familiar names. Great to have you back. If this is your first workshop with me, please feel free to ask all the questions you want to ask in the chat, or we're a small enough group, so if you want to use your emoji and raise your hand, we'll invite you to unmute yourself, and then we can go from there. And if you're back, you know how this works. So it's great to be here, great to be having this conversation, because money is always on a lot of our minds, and boy, is it an interesting time to be thinking about money. So hopefully now you can see my screen. I have shared my slides, and per usual, you'll be getting a copy of these afterwards. So take screen grabs if you want to do that, or just sit back and relax and know that you'll have all of this information in your inbox at some point. As Peter said, my name is Elaine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining you from Dublin, Ohio, which is just a little bit north of Columbus, the capital, and I am on Kashkashkia and Hopewell Indigenous and Cultural Lands. I'll share a visual description in case you are listening instead of watching. I am a 40-ish-year-old white woman with wavy blondish brownish hair, and I'm wearing a tweed jacket tonight, trying to channel my inner professor via tweed. I am a CPA by training, a certified professional accountant, and I also have something called a professional financial specialist designation, which is the kind of investment budgeting planning side of CPA world. And then I'm an accredited financial counselor as well. So that's sort of, I like to describe it as kind of the human aspect of money, married with the taxes and the budgeting and the investing and everything else that goes into it. Because as we know, money's never really about the money. It's about all the extra emotions and feelings that go around the money, which is why sharing information and community and connectivity in these forums is so important, so that we can support each other as we are navigating all of these challenges. I like to say I am the luckiest money person ever, because all of my work is with creative individuals. I work with arts councils and funders and colleges and universities all across the country, bringing this information to creative individuals to better support the business and financial side of their creativity. So I hope as you continue attending events and winning awards and doing all the wonderful things you'll do, our paths will cross a few more times. As we're diving into tonight's content, I want to take a moment to share a couple of ground rules. This is a place where you should feel comfortable both taking space and making space for others. So as I mentioned, make sure your questions are answered. I have an eye on your videos and also an eye on the chat window. So you can put your questions in the chat, or if you want to share an emoji or raise your hand, we'll invite you to unmute yourself to say your question out loud. And of course, we are all equal parts teachers and learners in this space. I'll be sharing a lot of information and research and sort of predictions about what might happen in the future and things we can do to prepare for that. But you are the expert in your own experience. So that means you get to take this information and apply it to your own practice in a way that works for you, because you are the expert in you. I'm here to provide some information, but you get to decide what to do with that. And of course, we want to make sure if there are stories that are shared as part of this workshop, we want to make sure those stories stay within the space, but by all means, take the lessons from those stories and carry them with you. Although I am a CPA, all of this information is for educational purposes only and not to be used as tax, legal, or accounting advice, but you probably knew that. So, we're talking about money tonight, specifically funding in this age of COVID that we are in. But more specifically, we want to talk about some of the financial impacts faced by musicians as a result of this moment we're in. Many of you have probably felt many of those impacts in your own lives. We will strategize some actionable solutions to some very big problems, and we'll highlight some financial wellness strategies. So very specific things you can be thinking about as we all emerge and begin performing again and figure out what this next wave of our industry is going to look like. I do not have to tell you that times are tough in the arts right now. This has been covered extensively, and we all feel this very, very deeply to our cores. Americans for the Arts has been doing heroic research into what has been going on and how this moment has impacted organizations and individuals. And they've quantified the economic impact of the pandemic on the arts industry at $15.2 billion. That's billion with a B, which is a huge economic impact. The median loss faced by arts organizations is about $30,000, which means there are as many organizations who have lost more than that as there are who have lost less than that. And when we think about opportunities for musicians to be paid, many of those opportunities come from nonprofit institutions, from performance groups or symphonies or orchestras or other nonprofit institutions that are facing these very, very severe losses and figuring out how to navigate a challenging revenue situation. 96% of organizations have canceled events. For me, this sort of begs the question what the other 4% have been doing, because I don't know of a single organization that hasn't canceled anything. And 72% of organizations have modified their operations in some way. And of course, for performing organizations, operations include a whole lot of performances. So there have been some pretty substantial modifications. The actions organizations have taken are broken down here in front of you. 30% of organizations have laid off staff, and some of those layoffs have been very severe. About 35% of organizations have imposed pay cuts on the individuals they pay, both the creative individuals and the non-creative administrative professionals they pay. About 45% of organizations have used reserves, so money they had saved over time or had built up through investments or other access to resources. They have dipped into those reserves in order to continue to balance their budgets, meet their operating expenses, et cetera, which is a big deal because it is hard for organizations to build up reserves, and it's going to be increasingly hard for organizations to replenish those reserves because, of course, once they're gone, right, then your earnings power from those reserves goes away as well. We also see that over 70% of organizations have pivoted online in some way. And if you are like me, you have attended a whole lot of virtual events. You've probably watched virtual performances. You have probably had virtual experiences delivered to your inbox. You may have even participated in sort of virtual experiences that also included maybe a delivered dinner or some sort of tangible something that was left somewhere outside of your apartment or something, right? Some of those experiences have been interesting. Some have been pretty terrible. The quality of production and performance has certainly varied tremendously, right? But I think it's been really interesting to watch what this pivot online has looked like, certainly for arts organizations, but also for every single company and entity and organization that exists right now. We know our colleges and universities have pivoted online, some under duress or kicking and screaming. We know our performance organizations have pivoted online. And we know most companies have pivoted online in some way, shape, or form as well. And what's especially interesting to me is that 67% of the organizations that did pivot online plan to continue online in some capacity. Now, in speaking with them anecdotally, most are not planning to do everything they are doing online because we all recognize there is a human component, especially in performance arts, that cannot necessarily be fully replicated online. But I think we've also recognized that there are a lot of really wonderful things about sharing what we do online. We've been able to reach greater audiences. Certainly, geography is no longer a limiting factor to who can watch a performance or a recital you might be giving, right? So we are able to reach additional people. And we're also able to reach audience members that we may not have been able to reach before. So thinking about reaching parents who might not otherwise be able to get a babysitter, who still might want to experience a performance, or those with disabilities who might not necessarily be able to navigate physical spaces, who can still enjoy a performance, or those with any other sort of limiting factors that might make it more comfortable for them to consume a creative performance at home. It's been really interesting to observe the positive impacts of this pivot online, and also to learn how we can do this really well and really effectively, especially with more time to plan what that looks like, so that we can really capture the good things about pivoting online and continuing that in some way, shape, or form. And since this group tends to be a group of emerging musicians or those who are at relatively earlier stages in your careers, I see this as a tremendous opportunity for you because you've been able to watch this industry shift in real time, which means you are as familiar with this as people who have been in the industry for 30 or 40 years. So you are coming at this with a fresh perspective and the exact same amount of online experience as everyone else in the industry. So I think there's a real opportunity there for you to lean into this perspective and imagine what this next iteration of the arts industry can be. And that for me is really exciting. And I can't wait to see what you'll come up with. When we think about funding for arts organizations, you can see how that funding tends to break down on average in this pie chart. This is data from National Endowment for the Arts, another amazing resource of some great research. We know that performing arts groups and museums tend to get about 40% of their income from earned sources. So ticket sales or admissions fees or the sale of some sort of good, right? That's what we would call an earned source. Oh, it looks like the pie chart maybe is not showing. I'm sorry about that. Is it working now? Oh, good. So I cannot explain why that works or doesn't work occasionally, but thanks for the thumbs up. I'm glad that worked. So now you can see the pie chart that shows the breakdown of how performing arts groups and museums in the United States earn income. 40% comes from those earned sources. And about 45% comes from contributed sources. So these would be gifts given out of the goodness of someone's heart, whether that someone is an individual or a corporation, a government entity, or a foundation. And then the remaining amount tends to come from investments, or if the entity has an endowment, which is one of those pools of money that they are technically not allowed to spend, but they're able to spend any investment earnings from that pool, that would make up the rest of the sources of income. And what's interesting about this moment in time, and what makes this potential economic impact different from, say, the economic crisis of 2008 or any of the previous economic crises that we've lived through, is that this particular crisis has impacted every single one of those funding sources. So our earned income has been shut down, in some cases completely, and in some ways just modified, because our organizations were closed. They had to cancel events or performances. And especially early on, some of the modifications that we were doing were not generating earned income. Very often, if we were offering performances online, they were being offered for free, sometimes with an ask for a contribution, but very often they were being offered for free as a way of building and maintaining community during a crisis without really thinking about using them to generate earned income. We also know that individual contributions have been affected. Why? Because individuals have been really affected by this. Now, there's some disparity. Some individuals are doing just fine and continue to be very generous, but a lot of individuals are suffering. Unemployment numbers were at an all-time high in 2020, and a lot of individuals who were able to continue to support their favorite causes were feeling moved to support causes that were feeding people or providing shelter, or supporting some of the protest movements from last summer, specifically the Black Lives Matter movements in response to the murder of George Floyd. So individuals were feeling a little conflicted and maybe taking money they otherwise would have given to arts organizations and given them to causes that felt a little bit more urgent at the time. Similar things were happening with corporate and foundation giving. Much like individuals, our corporations were facing economic challenges. Now, again, there were some industries that were doing well, but overall, a lot of corporate entities were struggling and a lot of foundations were struggling as well. And many of these entities, especially early on, so we're thinking March, April, May, June of the pandemic last year, they were prioritizing giving to other causes and other industries instead of the arts. We saw support for diversity movements increase and support for food insecurity, housing insecurity, social services, all of those sort of causes increased in their giving. And in some cases, giving those dollars moved away from the arts towards some of those very important needs. But again, that has a huge impact on how our organizations earn money and gather resources. Governmental funding has been an interesting one because this is kind of moving in two different directions, right? We saw a lot of curtailed revenue in 2020 for our governmental entities, right? If you think about how cities, for example, and states fund most of their operations, many of them collect sales tax. Sales tax, of course, is imposed on people buying things. And we weren't buying a whole lot last year. We weren't going to events. We weren't dining out as much. We weren't shopping in stores and buying lots of things, right? Because people were kind of shut down for all intents and purposes, and the economic activity reflected that. So if you look at the modeling that different cities and states are doing, they're realizing, and they realized last year, that a lot of their revenue from sales taxes in particular was going to go down. And if you live in a place that imposes any sort of hotel tax or tourism tax, sometimes we call them bed taxes, anything like that, that generates a whole lot of income at the governmental level because of travel to a particular place or conventions that might happen or kind of major events that occur in different cities, with all of those being canceled, you can see the revenue impact on our cities was pretty severe. The city of Austin, Texas was one of the early ones to share the impact they were facing because they were one of the early kind of cancellations of major events. South by Southwest is the major event they canceled in early 2020, and they quantified the impact of all of that lost revenue on their city. And what do you think some of that tourism tax revenue funds? Well, it funds the arts. And when you look at the impact of that over time, we're going to continue to see some curtailed governmental funding. But at the same time, we've had the federal government stepping in with tremendous relief packages, including lots of dollars going to individuals through those stimulus payments, and also relief dollars going to the National Endowment for the Arts, that then spreads it out among the state's arts councils, that then spreads it out among organizations in the arts, right? So we have these kind of two competing things happening with governmental funding. But all of that is to say, there's still a lot of uncertainty there and high competition for some of those dollars that are flowing through our governmental sources. Investments and endowments are kind of similar as well. In some ways, we've seen a lot of increased returns. If you pay attention to sort of market movements, you'll see that the investment markets continue to increase over time. And that is despite some economic data that suggests maybe they shouldn't be doing that. But there's still a lot of uncertainty there. And as we know, if any of these invested dollars are endowed dollars, that means they cannot necessarily be spent. It is only the earnings of those investments that can be spent by organizations. So unlike previous crises where we may have seen impact in maybe some of these categories, but not all of them, this current moment in time has affected every single potential source of revenue for our arts organizations. So those finance employees at arts organizations have been doing some really heroic creative work in figuring out how to gather resources from emergency sources and creative sources and increased individual contributions from those who are still able to give in order to continue to maintain operations. But all of that is just on the organizational side. Things are really tough for individual artists right now as well, especially musicians. 94.5% of artists, according to data from Americans for the Arts, have lost income during this pandemic. And the average loss per artist has been just over $12,000 or so. Now, many of you are performers, so you might see that number and say, oh my gosh, I wish I had only lost $12,000 last year. But remember, this is an average loss, right? So that means this is skewed by a whole lot of data that is going in to create this average number. And that's some serious dollars, right? Spread out over your year, this is $1,000 a month, which can have a big impact on everything you are doing. Americans for the Arts also asked those who responded to the survey how they were coping with this moment in time. And what we saw is, per usual, creative individuals were finding creative solutions to navigate these very challenging times. But these solutions are not necessarily sustainable long term. For example, a huge percentage of artists applied for relief in the form of grants. Some of you may have been part of this as well. If you collected a PPP grant or were part of the EIDL grant or loan through the Small Business Administration, you may have approached your state arts council or other foundations. There was a conglomeration of creative organizations, artistrelief.org, that was giving out emergency grants. Lots of cities were doing this as well, right? So there was a lot of emergency relief available, but most of that emergency relief has already been spent, right? Many creative individuals applied for unemployment. And again, the CARES Act expanded the individuals who were eligible for unemployment, which meant a lot of freelancers and performers all of a sudden could apply for unemployment. And even though we have extended unemployment quite a few times now, we're still approaching the end of those extended weeks of unemployment, which means it's probably not going to be a sustainable solution. Some have gotten loans from friends or family or financial institutions. And many, this is just over 30% or so, have earned income from non-artistic or creative work. Now, I'm not opposed to that. I think that can be a great source of income. But what I don't see on here is sort of creative pivoting, right? And I worry that moving away from income from the arts is going to, again, not be a long-term sustainable solution. There is this other category, so it's possible that there are some other solutions in here that are not showing up in detail. But for example, in working with a lot of musicians, especially towards the end of last year, I started to kind of notice a theme that many of them had moved into recording or licensing type of music arrangements, knowing, of course, that all of their performances had been canceled and would be for at least through early parts of 2021. Right? So many of them had really leaned into recording opportunities and had explored partnerships that maybe weren't quite as appealing before, but then became more appealing as that was kind of the only option available to them. So I think we'll continue to see interesting things like that emerge. But of course, right, there's probably not a need for every single person to start doing recorded music work, right? We need to see some of the loosening of the restrictions so that performances can start again. What's interesting too about sort of the music industry broadly is that we know 2020 was awful, right? Goldman Sachs shared about a 25% revenue loss for the music industry overall in 2020. And to be clear, this is not only the classical music industry, this is the entire music industry, right? So keep that context in mind. But they're also predicting a strong rebound this year. In fact, they are predicting 6% growth per year in the industry through 2030, which is really good. I would be thrilled to see that level of growth over the next 9 years or so. Now, of course, that growth is over a smaller base since we did have revenue loss in 2020, but strong rebound feels like a really nice way to describe this year. And I'm curious if that is sort of what you're experiencing. And my hope is that it is. Again, if you're having a reaction to this, feel free to put some comments in the chat and we'll call them out. But with that in mind, the acknowledgement that things have been really tough, the predictions that things will get better, and the observation that vaccine rates have sort of plateaued, but we're at a not terrible space of about 45% or so of the population having gotten at least one shot. We're seeing loosening of restrictions. We're seeing larger groups gather. We're entering a season for most of the country when people can be outdoors and maybe attend performances, right? So there is a lot of optimism here. So the question for you, of course, is what to do with all of that information, knowing that grants are still competitive and might be tough, knowing that individuals, many of them are still suffering economically, and knowing that there is, some hope on the horizon. What should we do? So I've broken down 3 kind of ideas that could make sense for what you could do. The first is to quite simply define your value. In some cases, redefining your value as well. We want to identify and look for opportunities to use that value, specifically leaning into your strengths. And then we want to make sure that you continue to be really smart financially, given how much uncertainty is still on the horizon. So let's walk through these one at a time. The first is to define your value. Very often when I ask someone, what do you do? They give me a noun in response. They'll say, I'm a musician, I'm a performer, I'm a violinist, I'm a bassist, right? There is a noun that's the answer to that question, which essentially is what you put on your tax form, right? What is your profession? Musician, performer, bassist, right? There's a noun there, but that's not super descriptive, right? I get that you play an instrument, you're in the music industry, right? But that doesn't really tell me what you do, right? It tells me what the title of your profession is, but not really what you do. And there's no kind of value inherent in that necessarily. At the other end of the spectrum, we have your full bio, something that I would read in a concert program, or maybe a long description of you and your work on your website. And this is probably too long. It's probably really interesting to people who already love you or who are deeply invested in the music industry, but it's probably way too much information for a casual conversation that starts with, what do you do? Or tell me about your work, or something like that. So what I'm looking for, and what I would suggest we kind of get some clarity around, is this center Goldilocks zone between what you put on your tax form and your full bio. And in entrepreneurship world, we would call this your unique value proposition, or your UVP. And that's a very entrepreneurial term that I am not crazy about. So let's break that down piece by piece. The unique part identifies what makes you different. Oh, it seems like the slides might be lagging a little bit. I'm sorry about that. Boy, we're just having all sorts of technology problems tonight. The unique part is what makes you different, or what makes you special. What are your strengths that you bring to this conversation? Value is what you do to change the world. And the proposition piece is how you are going to do that. So if we were to break these down in order, you could spend some time brainstorming the things that make you really unique and special, what you do to really add value to the world, and then how you do it. And that value piece, the middle piece, is interesting to me as well, because many of you probably add value in some different contexts. You might add value as a performer. You might add value as an organizer or an administrator. Perhaps you're leading a chamber group or something like that. Or you might add value as an instructor or a teacher at the college level, as an adjunct of students privately, right? So you might have different ways of adding value, each of which is important to explore. And when we think about the value you add and how you add value, that proposition piece, it's important to say out loud that the context here is really important, because the value you provide and how you do it may have changed, right? Your strengths and what makes you special and powerful and incredible and capable probably have not changed. If anything, they've probably broadened and gotten deeper in some areas, right? But what you do and how you do it has probably changed, especially over the past year or so. So reassessing that is an important exercise to go through, especially as you continue to have conversations with different individuals or funders or collaborators about what projects might look like for this summer or beyond. So as you're thinking about your strengths, this could be a good moment for a screen grab, or if you're reviewing the slides later, this is a moment where you can see a box that says strengths, and then you can see a smaller box that says weaknesses, right? I would spend some time brainstorming your strengths. These can be personal strengths, professional strengths, creative strengths. Really get comfortable identifying the things that make you a fantastic musician, performer, technician, instructor, whatever it is, right? Get some clarity around what those strengths are. And you'll see there's a space for weaknesses here. That is only there because I know sometimes it's hard to list your strengths without also acknowledging your weaknesses. So if you need to put them somewhere, you can put them somewhere. However, I will note that the space devoted to strengths is probably 2 or 3 times bigger than the space devoted to weaknesses. So that's the ratio I would encourage you to aim for, right? Aim for at least 2 or 3 times as many strengths to listen as weaknesses. And then when you're thinking about your value, you're thinking about what you do and for whom you do it. And this is important to understand, especially that for whom part, because as we're thinking about reassessing our value and really getting clarity around what we do, the natural next step is to say, okay, who needs or wants what we do? And where are there opportunities there to match our strengths and what we do with someone who really values those strengths? So this is going to be important to get clarity on as well. And yes, your music might serve everyone, and it might not be discriminatory in who it aims to serve. But it's important to really get some clarity around the target audience, if you will, so that you can effectively have conversations that move you forward. And then the proposition piece is how you are going to do what you do, right? And this is where I think there is a lot of opportunity to really think about what how looks like in terms of your career, especially over the next year or so. We know the industry is going to rebound and grow. We know organizations are continuing to lean into technology. So what does that mean for you? And how can you observe those trends and incorporate them into your practice in a way that really makes sense? So as you're brainstorming all of those things and bringing them together into that unique value proposition, what we're really doing is aiming for a 1 or maybe 2 sentence summary, knowing that you can go deeper and share more information if it's important to do that. Because this is just the start of a conversation. This is not meant to be a long soliloquy or the end to a conversation. It's just the beginning, meant to pique someone's interest into continuing the conversation. You could use this as you are at a networking event, when we start going to those with more regularity. You could use it when you are meeting individuals, when you're attending the virtual Next Fest gathering this summer, or when you're attending any other types of events you might be attending. You can use this if you are applying for grants as your opening sentence into your biography or something like that. You could use it on your website or on your Instagram handle or on your TikTok description if that's a platform that works for you, right? So think about different places to make this work for you. And of course, you can draft as many of these unique value propositions as you might want. And that's okay because you do a lot of different things. I have a couple of examples here to share, and these are all from individuals I have worked with over the years. And I will say, these unique value propositions did not start where you will see them, right? This is the final polished version of them. And they went through a lot of drafts and a lot of practice sessions before they landed here. But I'll share them with you. One is, I disrupt the expected environment with jarring compositions. That's powerful. We have a strong action verb there, disrupt. And then this person does pop-up performances in unexpected places, right? So they're using their performances to kind of surprise people in a place that they might not necessarily expect to have a performance. And that's a key part of what they do. They disrupt the expected environment with jarring compositions. That is way more interesting than I play music, right? The next one is I explore racial and gender binaries through the emotions of music. That tells us so much about what the composition is and what is being explored through the composition. And touching on that emotion of music piece is really important. Next, we have an educator who shares, I inspire young composers by mixing Lady Gaga and Bach. Again, that's so much more interesting than saying, I teach students music, right? Yes, that is what you're doing on a daily basis. But what you're doing is so much more than that. You're teaching about the underlying structures and helping students recognize patterns that they see in contemporary music and in classical music, and understanding how those patterns repeat over time. And you're inspiring them with that. And then lastly, I facilitate meaningful experiences by creating cozy chamber concerts. Again, that tells us so much about the value this person is providing through their performances. I will pause here to get some reaction from you. What are you thinking as you are reflecting on some of these unique value propositions, or a version of this that might be an elevator pitch, or a 30-second spiel that you may have shared? What are your reactions? It's also okay if you don't have any reactions. That is totally normal. Or if you are typing up your reactions, I will keep an eye on that chat. Here's a question that just came through. Thank you, Audrey, for sharing this question. Who might the audience for these unique value propositions be? The audience is really someone that you are getting to know, right? So this could be something you share at a networking event, or maybe if you're attending something this summer and you have an opportunity to have a masterclass with someone, and you go around the room and introduce yourselves. You might say, share your name and then share kind of what you do, or share your unique value proposition. For example, I'm Elaine, and I inspire young composers by mixing up Lady Gaga and Bach, right? That is a more interesting introduction than saying, I'm Elaine and I teach students music, right? So we're going for something that's sort of memorable and really captures the value that you provide. And you might find yourself sharing that with others in an introductory session. Or if you are applying for grants, it could be your first sentence in the narrative about what you want to do with this grant. For example, I'm Elaine and I inspire young composers by mixing Lady Gaga and Bach, and I'm interested in pursuing this project to expand the reach of my summer programs, or something like that, right? You could also use it on your website if there was a place that you wanted to put it there. You could put it on your social media platforms in that bio section, or maybe you could put it on LinkedIn. Maybe for you, this is a place where you want to maybe be seen as an emerging leader in the music industry by sharing some insightful things you've gleaned over the past year. And maybe you're going to do that on LinkedIn, right? So maybe this lives in your LinkedIn bio or something like that. So really kind of any place where it feels like it's a good time for you to express the value you share and create with the world. There's another comment in the chat that I love. This person says, it's always challenging to create these encapsulations, but not to sound pompous or cheesy. And boy, isn't that the truth, right? Because there is an element of pompousness in there, right? When we think about saying, I'm a musician, or I'm an artist, or I'm an educator, that is a single noun that people immediately recognize, right? And it doesn't brag. But when we're bragging, we are sharing the real value we provide, but sometimes that can be distasteful, right? And especially given any of the context in our world, some individuals find that more distasteful for certain groups of people, right? Marginalized communities, right, have much less room to be seen as pompous or bragging, right? Which is a real challenge. And yet, if we are asking for money in a grant situation, or thinking about a collaboration with a corporate entity, or identifying potential clients that might want to make use of our strengths, there's an interesting moment where we can, in fact, state our value. Now, the cheesy part is absolutely there as well. And this is where some of that editing really does need to make sense, right? This has to be something that you can say comfortably and it feels like something you would say. Which means saying something like, I disrupt the expected environment with jarring compositions might not be your unique value proposition, right? Because it has to be words that are really authentic to you. Otherwise, it's going to fall completely flat. But I'd encourage you to play around with it, right? And don't be afraid about editing and re-editing and cutting and pasting and throwing out different drafts, because it is very possible that you will eventually land on something that describes your value without sounding pompous, and certainly without sounding cheesy, unless you are the cheese person, in which case lean into that. But definitely wait until it feels like it's for you. And then practice it so it can very naturally roll off your tongue instead of being something that you have to kind of pause or look up or read off of your phone or something. So that would be my first suggestion. Spend some time thinking about your strengths, thinking about what you do, thinking about how you do it, and see if you can pull that into a unique value proposition. And if you can, then you'll be on your way to put that into your website or a place where it can start working for you, especially if you are looking for opportunities to use your strengths, which is our next action item here. So the first thing to do is define your value. Then we want to look for opportunities. Here's a breakdown of how artists get paid in the United States. And you will see creative individuals get paid from a lot of different pockets, which is how this industry works, right? Many people pull together revenue from a lot of different sources. And there is content on this on the Next Fest YouTube channel around portfolio careers and strategizing different ways of earning money and setting your rates in different contexts. So I'd encourage you to check out all of that content as well. And also recognize that individuals get paid from a lot of different pockets, which means there are a lot of opportunities for you to use your strengths in ways that serve these different pockets, right? So for example, if you look back over the past year, or maybe that's a terrible example because the world was so crazy, but if you're looking, say, forward about what your fall looks like and how you might get paid from different sources, how do they compare to this chart of how artists typically get paid? And if you notice that your numbers are different from maybe what these numbers look like, that might suggest that there's an opportunity there. So how do artists get paid? We see the biggest category here is that artists get paid from other individuals, right? So let's pretend you're a music teacher and parents of your students pay you money. That would be getting paid by an individual, right? Or maybe you run a chamber group and you mostly do performances for very wealthy individuals who host parties in their homes, right? Those would be individuals paying you for something. Or maybe you're a performer and you collect money from streaming, or you sell merchandise, or you sell recordings in some way, shape, or form. You're probably selling them to other individuals, right? So those are all examples of how individuals might compensate you as a musician. And you can see in the arts, that is the biggest category. This is data, again, from Americans for the Arts about how artists were paid, and just over 18,000 or so artists collected money from individuals, which makes sense. There's also probably some opportunity there. We also know that artists get paid by for-profit companies. So we'll talk about nonprofits in a second. Your orchestras, your symphonies, your nonprofit performing groups, those are all in this nonprofit category. But for-profits pay artists as well. These are divided into creative for-profits, that's sort of the bottom half of this bar, and then non-creative for-profits. So think for a moment about, say, a corporate entity that might hire you to perform for a holiday party they are hosting for their clients. If the corporate entity is an advertising agency, that would count as a creative for-profit company that might compensate you. If it is a financial institution or a hotel, that is probably a non-creative for-profit company. Within nonprofits, again, we have symphonies and orchestras that fall in this creative category, but we also have hospitals and food banks and other not-for-profit organizations and entities, museums perhaps, that might hire individuals or creative individuals to perform. We are seeing so much investment in hospital arts right now. A lot of it is in the form of art therapy, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. We know our essential workers have had quite a year. We know individuals that have been passing through the hospital system are staying longer and having more challenges, which means we know the impact of arts in those hospitals is going to be even stronger than it would normally be. So are there opportunities within your community to lean into that non-creative, nonprofit hospital to see if there's an opportunity to lead a performance session once a week, or maybe once a month, or do some recordings and then sell those recordings to the hospital if attending in person isn't viable in your community right now? So what opportunities might exist in that category? We also know artists get paid by educational institutions. This is certainly in the form of teaching, but it's also in the form of paying them as performers, paying them as guest artists, paying them for residencies that might come up, right? So there are a lot of different opportunities here. Although I will say it is a very tough time to be in the education industry. The shift to online has impacted our educational institutions pretty tremendously, and it's impacted those faculty members as well. So this is probably not the first area where I would lean into identifying opportunities yet. I might give them a year or so to recover, to see what happens with enrollment, to see how that industry continues to change over time, because it will rebound in some way, shape, or form, and the opportunities will still continue to be there. But I see a faster rebound happening with some of our individuals and certainly with some of our for-profit companies. So those could be areas to put a little bit more of your focus on right now. And then lastly, we know that artists get paid by governmental entities as well. Mostly this is creative governmental entities. So these would be your arts councils or something like that along those lines. But there are also governmental entities, especially along the lines of tourism or economic development, that also pay artists as well. So as you're thinking about all of these different opportunities and the way other artists get paid, again, I would reflect on how your revenue breaks down by these categories and see if there are opportunities that might be there for you to match your strengths, your value, the thing you do really well with a company or an entity or an individual that needs those strengths. And I would focus on the groups that are doing okay right now. We know that some individuals are really suffering, but we also know that some individuals are doing okay. We've seen lots of saving over the past year or so, and also an interest in spending money, especially now. So what does it look like to create a performance opportunity for individuals to attend? Or if it's not going to be live, what does it look like to create something online? There was a musician I was working with who, along with a friend, started a weekly performance series. And this had a really high production value. They had lots of incredible equipment, and they wanted to distinguish their online performance series by having a really high production value. And so they set up a pay what you want kind of model. They blasted out this opportunity to their networks. And what they ended up doing was doing a 50-50 revenue share so that the performer took 50% of the revenue, and then the organizers took the other 50% to help cover streaming costs and all the equipment costs and promotion of the event and all of those other kind of administrative costs. And what's interesting about that is looking at how that has grown over time and exploring how many individuals just come once because they care about the particular performer that week versus how many people start attending on a regular basis. And is there a marketing opportunity to say, you came to attend this performance. What would it look like if I reached out to you 6 weeks later and said, hey, I know you loved this artist. Here's another artist we think you might like performing this Friday night, right? So there's interesting opportunities there to think about growing that individual audience, but it takes time. We're also seeing individuals get more and more comfortable with using platforms like Patreon or subscription type models where they are providing support to artists on an ongoing basis, right? And I know many of you have been leaning into these platforms for years, but what's really interesting to me is how increasingly older individuals are getting comfortable with kind of what this looks like and what it looks like to support an individual artist on a monthly basis. And so if that's something that feels like it might make sense to you, what does that opportunity look like? And how can you start giving yourself time to really build that audience so that it makes sense for you? I also am really, really interested in opportunities showing up in the non-creative for-profit sector. These would be companies that we know are doing okay right now. And we also know the arts add tremendous value to everything they're doing. So what does it look like to explore opportunities there? And I'll share a couple of stories. I'll say the companies or the industries that are doing well tend to be financial services, pharmaceuticals. Remember, our hospitals are nonprofits, right? But it is possible that you could have an arm of a hospital that's falling into this for-profit sector as well. Also, any logistics companies, any technology companies, grocery companies, they're all doing okay right now. I would not pursue a lot of opportunities in the hospitality sector. I think our hotels, our airlines, our restaurants have been really hit and they are not fully recovered yet. But retail is starting to bounce back a little bit, right? So what would it look like if there were a pop-up concert in a local retail establishment as sort of like a welcome back thing and some sort of pay what you want for the concert type of event? I don't know, but there's something interesting here to explore. Some of you may have heard me share this story before, so apologies if this is repetitive, but a dance company, which has plenty of parallels with a musical performance company as well, had developed a pretty good relationship with their bank over the past year or so. The head of this company got to know their banker really well because they were applying for those PPP funds and some of those other emergency grants. And during the course of those conversations, the head of the dance company shared what they were doing with the financial institution. And what this dance company was doing was offering digital care packages to their subscribers and their members. So someone could go onto their website and order a digital care package, which was a creative artistic expression created personally for the recipient using a couple of words that the sender would submit, and then it was delivered to them digitally. So for example, let's pretend for Mother's Day, I wanted to send my mother a digital care package. I would go on the website, I would enter my mother's name, and I might enter 3 words about her. Springtime, inspiring, loving, right? And then this dance company would assign that digital care package to one dancer who would create some sort of composition. They would intro it and say something like, "Hi, Rita, your daughter Elaine has sent you a digital care package. She describes you as springtime and loving and inspirational," and I forget the other adjectives I said. But then there would be this creative expression or experience, and then it would end with an invitation for my mother to then send a digital care package to someone else. So this went really well. It was a great way for this dance company to maintain connections with their audience after they reflected on the real value they provide, which was that one-on-one human connection between the performers and their audience members. So they turned that into a digital care package that they could continue to monetize during the pandemic. So they just happened to share that with their banker, very sort of smartly and suavely sharing that with their banker, right? And then they said, or they asked the banker if they would be interested in sending digital care packages to overworked employees or clients or other individuals that the banker was serving. And of course they were, right? So it took a global pandemic for them to get to know their banker really well. And then they seized an opportunity to say, okay, we know things in financial service world are going well right now. We know what we do really well is foster a human connection between performer and audience member. And then they pitched the idea to the banker, right? So as you stay curious about those types of opportunities, and as you kind of identify what they might look like in your world, it's interesting to me to hear and think about the creative things that might emerge. I will also say, we know nonprofits are going to rebound, right? In fact, the federal support dollars are flowing through them right now, and they are doing better than they were at this time last year. We also know it's going to continue to be tough. So be patient with the nonprofits, right? And think about really identifying that value and matching it with different opportunities to take some of the pressure off the nonprofit sector as well. I will pause here to get any reactions to that. There's a note from Janet. Janet, do not apologize. We know Wi-Fi can always be a little bit challenging. And we know several of you are in places where there are thunderstorms going on right now. So totally no apologies required. But what are your reactions to this idea of how artists get paid and opportunities you might find within those different bars? I'll pause here in case people are typing away furiously.
Elaine, I think it's just really interesting that you brought up that example of the dance company and the bank, because I think as artists, we're trained to think that we don't provide value to these people who have lots of resources and money, and they're very important in corporate and those type of things. But it makes perfect sense. The one thing that they can't provide is that human touch. So I think that's a great example and really inspiring, that actually the arts have a lot of value, that we can provide something to the bank that they can't provide for themselves. So that was a great. I have to think about this now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes, yes, and right. There's a comment in the chat about helpful perspective and examples, and another comment about the approach about making opportunities, which I think is a really powerful idea, right? Because sometimes in a perfect world, people would just love and value what we do, which would be lovely. And, gosh, I would dream of that world, right? And there are real amazing things you do that do have value. And sometimes it's just a matter of creating some of those conversations by leaning into those relationships and the networks you already have to think about kind of what that looks like. Not in a cheesy, salesy, how am I going to trick this bank into giving me money kind of way. That's not what we're doing, right? This is not a tricky sales technique, because you have tremendous value to share with others. And there are some opportunities out there, which I think is interesting to continue to explore. So as you continue exploring them, definitely let me know. There was another story I'll share about sort of a similar experience, except it had to do with grocery workers. And the idea, and this was a visual artist group, and the idea was that creating art can be very healing, and our essential workers in the grocery industry have had a really tough year. Some of them were getting additional hazard pay for a while, some were not. They have been dealing with irate customers and all sorts of challenging human behaviors that no essential worker should have to deal with. So the visual arts company pitched an idea to do sort of a recovery type of workshop for these essential workers by leaning into some creative expressions. It would be totally free, open to the individuals, the essential workers who were attending, and they would be paid for the time that they were attending this, right? Because our grocery companies were doing okay. They could pay their people an extra 2 hours to attend a paint class or a craft class or something like that. And of course, the grocery company paid the visual arts company to deliver that content and provide the supplies and all of that. So yes, there's altruism here. There's real value we're delivering in human connection. And because there's value there, that means we can also charge a reasonable rate for our time, and that is also okay. If you need help on calculating those reasonable rates, there is a video from the Next Fest on that. So as you're thinking about defining your value in a way that makes sense for you and doesn't feel cheesy or pompous, but does really get to the heart of the value you provide, and as you look for opportunities to use and deliver that value, perhaps to individuals or companies or organizations or entities you hadn't thought about as clients before, we also want to remember to be smart financially. Now, musicians are some of the most financially smart and astute individuals I have the privilege of working with. So some of these things might feel a little trite to you if you are one of those individuals. And it's always nice to have some reminders too. If we were to sort of distill all finance into a few key points, the first one would be to spend less than you make, period. Now, we know in the arts that is really, really hard because in the arts, our income often fluctuates pretty dramatically. If we were spending less than we made and you had a very predictable day job that would pay you every 2 weeks the same amount, it would be easier to just plan to spend less than you make. However, many of you, especially if you rely on performance income or touring income or support from individuals, we know that this fluctuates and it's seasonal in many cases, which means you may have a couple months where you don't actually spend less than you make, and that's okay. We want to look at this holistically, but we definitely want to pay attention probably if we have a certain number of months in a row where we are not spending less than we make. For me, this is 3 months in a row. That's when, from a business planning perspective, I start to kind of panic because my business is seasonal as well. I tend to get really busy in the spring because people always want to talk about taxes. And then over the summer, things quiet down a little bit, right? So I know this. I know how the seasonal fluctuations work, and I can pay attention to them. And I also know when it's time to start panicking, right? So figure out what your panic moment is, and then start paying attention to that. We also want to be setting aside funds for taxes and savings. There is a chart here that shows the US personal savings rates, specifically in 2020. Now, over time, humans in the United States save about 7-ish% of what they make. That's an average number. Lots of individuals save less, some save more. It depends on where you are living geographically, what your income level is, how many other humans or furry creatures you might be supporting, right? So there's a lot that goes into this number. But if we know on average, people save about 7 or 8%, and we look at what happened in 2020, look at this spike in the savings rate. In April, people were saving more than 30% of what they were making. Now, partially that's because we were in the middle of a global pandemic and everything was shut down. And partially it is because there were stimulus payments that went out and there was expanded unemployment benefits, including that extra $600 a week payment that was taking so much pressure off of individuals. We also know student loans were in forbearance, so people didn't have to make those payments. And we know a lot of rental obligations had been deferred. So all of those things contributed to a much higher savings rate. And there are things we can think about or habits we can try to preserve from that moment in time. And yes, we can make systematic federal policy level changes to enact some of those things long term. But in the meantime, while that is happening, what can we personally do to make sure we are setting aside funds for taxes and savings? One of my favorite things to do is, if you are paid as a freelancer or a contractor, every time you are paid, take 30% and save it for your taxes, because as someone who is self-employed, you pay a whole lot of taxes. So 30% is probably enough to cover federal, state, and local taxes. And then take 20% and set it aside in savings. Now, what we've done there is basically cut your earnings in half, because if you're setting aside 30% for taxes and 20% for savings, that's 50% that you are not spending on your business or your rent or your new instrument or your Wi-Fi or food or anything else you might need. Which means you need to be doing more gigs or charging more for each gig in order to make the money work. But the only way you'll be able to set aside enough for taxes and savings is to do it with intention. So that would be my second piece of advice. First, spend less than you make. Second, proactively set aside funds for savings and taxes. Then I'd suggest spending some time thinking about what diversifying your income really looks like, right? Again, we know that every single source of income that artists normally rely on was affected last year, right? So clients I have that wait tables or bartend in addition to performing found their performing income went away, and also their serving income or bartending income went away because everything shut down. So diversifying your income isn't sort of a magical solution to not have financial problems. We know that is too simple. But if we think about ways to diversify your income while still balancing your time, then there are some choices you can make to make the numbers work while retaining some sort of control over what you're doing, right? So thinking about those additional sources of income, or maybe leaning into a corporate performance gig every once in a while, or some recording gigs here and there, even if it's not the most exciting thing you would want to be doing, while you are still preserving enough time to pursue that most exciting thing, whatever it is for you. Right? Because this will give you some protection, not perfect protection, but some protection to account for the fluctuations in income from these different sources. And again, thinking about different groups that might need or want what you do, as you're very clear on what you do, is not a bad place to start. Next, I'd suggest we grow our assets and shrink our debt. And again, this is presented as though it is a simple thing to do. Those words are not complicated, but actually doing that is very, very hard. So I'll remind you of an old business adage that you manage what you measure. And I'd suggest that you measure your savings and other assets you might have, and also measure your debt over time. So if you start simply paying attention to the savings balance you have every month and the debt balance you have every month, just watch how those move over time. And if you are also intentionally setting aside a percentage of everything you're earning and adding it to your savings, what we would expect is to see that savings go up, knowing that sometimes that's not going to happen because you might not be able to save in one particular month, or you might have an emergency situation which requires you to use your savings. That's why it's there. But we want to measure this over time and watch that balance go up. And then when it comes to debt, what we want to be doing is paying more on your debt than the debt is costing you. So if you are looking at your balance of debt and that balance keeps going up over time, that means you probably want to increase your monthly payment on that debt. And now is not a bad time to do that, especially when it comes to student loans. Now, if you are someone who has student loans and those student loans are in forbearance because of the pandemic, that essentially means they are not costing you any interest right now. So every payment you make, even though you are not required to make payments right now, is shrinking your balance, which is not always true, especially if you are on an income-based repayment plan, right? So if you are able to put money towards student loans right now, that's not a terrible idea. Now, if you have credit card loans, I'd probably prioritize putting money towards those credit card loans instead to really shrink those balances as much as possible. Because again, we want to be paying more than the debt is costing us, because that is the only way to make the debt balance go down over time. And as we're thinking about this, right, we normally love to be perfectly balanced, except when it comes to assets and debt. We want our assets to keep getting bigger and we want our debt to keep getting smaller, right? Because that's how we build wealth over time. And then you keep doing it over and over and over again. Because we are transitioning out of pandemic times and because we are expecting growth in the industry, although it is going to be measured growth that is probably not just sort of insane explosion growth, although we might see some of that too, it's important to just kind of notice what's happening for you personally and in the industry. You might find yourself spending more money out in the world, including and especially for travel. We are in the spring holiday season right now. So if you travel to spend time with your families right now, or maybe you observe Ramadan and you're traveling more to break fast with friends and neighbors every night, right? Pay attention to how your spending is changing as we are coming out of the pandemic. You might be traveling this summer, making up for lost time, visiting family you haven't seen for maybe a year or longer. And you also might find yourself dining out more, supporting retailers more, contributing to your friends' Patreon accounts and supporting their Kickstarter projects. All of that is okay. Just pay attention to it because we still want to be spending less than we are making. And as we're watching our spending maybe grow a little bit, that's something we want to be paying attention to. If your student loans are in forbearance, those payments are going to restart again after September 30th. So make sure that is part of your planning for what you are going to do when those payments kick in again. And if you are someone who's been collecting unemployment, you might be coming to the end of your unemployment term, right? All of which means we need to continually repeat these steps just to make sure we're keeping track of what we are spending, making sure it's less than we're earning. We're identifying all those opportunities to collect value and monetize the strengths that we do really well. And we're just continuing to pay attention to that asset balance of our savings and that debt balance of any loans we may have to make sure it's going down over time. And then we just keep doing it and doing it and doing it again as we continue to evolve and get some more clarity about what is coming next. Here's a quick recap of what we highlighted this evening. We talked about the financial impact faced by musicians as a result of this pandemic, using data from Americans for the Arts and sharing some information from the NEA and also Goldman Sachs about predictions for the music industry going forward. We strategized 3 actionable solutions to these very big problems, which were defining value, looking for opportunities to capture that value, and then remaining smart financially. And then those smart financial strategies were part of that financial wellness strategy for musicians overall. I will pause here and take a peek at the chat. There's a question from Janet. Janet says, in Canada, we have credit reports that show our reliability for paying off debt. Tip to possibly increase your rating is pay your credit card within a few days of your statement date. So for example, if the bill is generated on May 24th, pay it on May 25th. That's a great tip, Janet. We have something similar in the United States. It is your credit report that you can pull from any of the 3 credit bureaus. Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax are those 3 bureaus. And in the United States, you can pull your credit report once a year for free from each of those bureaus. That's a result of the Fairness in Credit Reporting Act. I think that's the official name of the bill, signed by President Obama many years ago. So you can go to annualcreditreport.com, and that's the portal to access your free credit report once a year. And just like Janet says, that's broken down into some different sections. And the number one thing you can do to boost your credit report over time is pay your bills on time. That accounts for about 35% of your FICO credit score. The credit score is the number that basically tells a lender how reliable you are, right? Ranges from, I think it goes as low as 350 to 800 and some change or so, right? So there's a big range there. And your score will not be on your credit report, but the score is calculated based on all of the information in your credit report. So paying those bills on time is the number one most important thing you can do to boost that credit score. So that's a great thing to pay attention to. And it's not just credit cards. Credit cards definitely show up on your credit report for sure, but they're not the only thing. If you have utility payments that are in your name, those are reporting entities. So those payments show up on your credit report. Or if you have other types of payments, sometimes cell phones get reported. So if you have a cell phone in your name, that's showing up on your credit report. If you rent property, so from a sort of major company, if your landlord is like a dude and you pay cash to him or write a check to him, that's probably not making it to your credit report. But if you're renting an apartment from a company or a larger institution, that might be showing up. So get curious about that. And if your birthday is coming up, that's not a bad time to pull those annual credit reports, because once a year, you can just take a peek and make sure there's nothing suspicious there. Lovely message from Elizabeth. Thank you for that message. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed having you at these talks, so thanks so much. What other questions do you have? I'll continue pausing just on the off chance you are typing your questions right now. Peter, do you have any questions you'd like to make sure I address?
I don't know. I think you've covered so much. I think it's just always great to hear you describe all of these things in a way that's kind of non-threatening and feels doable, you know. So I think that's all really great. And as we're waiting for any questions that might come in, I just put in the chat a link to our website and a link to your website. And Elaine, you mentioned that you're going to forward those slides from today's to me, and I'll pass those along to everybody through a follow-up email. And yeah, and also just wanted to mention that this is our last of our spring series before we launch into our festival in June. And we would love to have your support to help pay all of these great artists and thinkers. So I put that in the chat as well. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
There is a question that has come in. This one says, what do you think about the trend of self-publishing or creating your own publishing company / recording label? Honestly, I'm in favor of it. There are some drawbacks, right? If you are self-publishing or doing anything by yourself, that means you need to do more heavy lifting when it comes to marketing, right? Which means the model or sort of the steps I might take to kind of go in that direction would be to really lean into building that community first, whether it is a community of supporters or community of partners or community even of sort of social media followers, right? I would spend the time really intentionally growing that community and then explore the self-publishing, right? Because as someone who is self-publishing, you're doing all the heavy lifting to not only create the thing and produce the thing, but then also share the thing so that someone will pay you for it, right? It's kind of the Amanda Palmer model. I don't know if you've seen her talk, The Art of Asking. There was a TED Talk. It's kind of brilliant, right? And she went back and forth from being represented by a record label and then mostly self-funding everything through Kickstarter. And pros and cons. I will say the talk is worth watching because she'll give you a lot of interesting things to think about. And It worked for her because she had that community. For her, it was about 25,000 fans or so. That's the number that ended up supporting her first Kickstarter. And ironically, that's about the number of albums she sold through her record label, right? So that ended up kind of working for her. Your number doesn't have to be 25,000, but I would say definitely invest the time to build the community if you are going to self-publish. And then, of course, the upside is you get all the revenue. You don't get a small royalty share. You get all of it minus your costs. So that's how I would sort of think about pros and cons and your own skill set. And good luck. Put me on your list if you do launch your own self-publishing company. What else? Thank you, Renee, for the comment. I'm glad you were here too. Ooh, here's another question. Do you have ideas for getting to know people in the for-profit world? Ooh, great question. I would say you probably know more people in the for-profit world than you think you do. So what I have my students do, and actually I'll send this handout to Peter too. It's called the Network Map Handout, and it's a circle, and it's not well designed because I designed it, right? So, forgive the word-based presentation, but it's a circle. And then the circle is divided into different kind of pie slices. And it's broken down into different kind of categories of people. And I hate to categorize people that way, but it's a helpful way to kind of think about who is in your network. And when my students fill this out, they have plenty of peers. They have a lot of mentors, right? Because, often through educational and conservatory programs, the mentor vibe is very strong, right? But they don't always have a lot of partners and they don't always have a lot of supporters. And those two categories, for me, a partner is not a legal partner in the sense of business, but someone who basically provides something of value to your business. So this could be your bookkeeper, this could be your web designer, this could be your assistant, maybe. I don't know if you have an assistant, probably not, right? But if you don't have any of those people, then think about all the software platforms that you use. So maybe you don't have a bookkeeper, but maybe you use Mint, right? So is Mint kind of a partner to you, or FreshBooks or Xero or Wave or any of these other platforms? Or maybe you use a composition software that you really love, right? Yeah, that doesn't necessarily feel like a human, but that's still a partner to you, right? And maybe you don't have a financial advisor, but you are a member of a credit union. And so that's where you store your money and you have bill pay through their system. That's a partner, right? And then supporters would be funders that you might have, right? So if you've ever gotten a grant, or if you've ever been selected for a residency or a fellowship program or a finalist for an award, or if a journalist has ever written something nice about you, right? All of those are supporters within your network, right? Or maybe you're a member of a local musicians guild or organization, or, just continue thinking about all these different groups you are a part of, right? And before you know it, that list of partners and supporters starts to get pretty long. And then if you scan through who your roommate knows and who your collaborators have worked with, before you know it, you have tangential connections to a whole lot of partners and supporters that you might not have realized are actually within your network. So once you've got that long list, then we say, okay, how do we maintain relationships with these individuals? A journalist who has written about you, or maybe sort of covered a recital you did, or someone who told you were a finalist for an award, right? Maybe they need a handwritten note twice a year that's like, hey, hope you're doing well. Or maybe you set up a Google alert for the group that gave you the award. And when there's a news story about them, you email that person and you say, hey, I saw that great coverage you got in the blah, blah, blah journal. Congratulations. I hope you're doing well, right? And so we just think about ways to continue fostering these relationships. Again, not in like a smarmy, manipulative way, but in a human to human connection kind of way, so that when you go into your credit union and you ask for a loan to purchase a new instrument, they're like, yeah, of course, we went to your last concert. It was amazing. Yes, here you go, or something, right? Because part of what we're doing is just continuing to build those relationships. So that's what I would do. I would brainstorm first, then think about maintaining the relationships. And if there are groups that you're like, gosh, I really wish I knew someone at this performance venue, well, go start hanging out there and see, because you might meet some really cool people while you're there. You are very welcome anytime. Final comment from Janet in the chat. Janet was going to an entrepreneurial lecture series in the before times, and a Q&A. You suggested that people save 6 months of operating costs before you even start to set up your business. And that didn't go over well. I'm sorry that didn't go over well, because gosh, that emergency reserve fund gives you so much freedom. And believe it or not, I just saw an article this morning, and I haven't checked these numbers yet, but the article I read this morning said both Google and Apple had about a year's worth of operating cash. And so if it's good enough for Google and Apple to sit on that level of cash, it's probably good enough for us to at least explore what that looks like too. Because, money buys you freedom. Not always, and certainly not happiness, but you have a lot of freedom there. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and having such wonderful questions. I cannot wait to see you all at the festival this summer. There's going to be so much good stuff going on. So I hope you will take full advantage of that. And Peter, huge thanks to you for everything you do to support this community. Your work is really hugely impactful, and I hope you know how much we all appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Elaine. It's always great to have you. I just feel like energized every time you do something with us. And for those of you who are going to be students at the festival, Elaine will be working with us for that too. And I'm so grateful for all your generosity all the way through all of this. And it's a bonus of the pandemic has been getting to know you and getting to know everybody who's coming to these talks. And so thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks, Elaine, for everything. And keep an eye out for a great schedule coming up. And couldn't be more excited. Thank you again, everybody. Take good care, stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks, Elaine. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Night.